Poison Elves by Drew Hayes originally began in 1991 as a self-published comic magazine titled I, Lucifer. However, by the 8th issue, the series was renamed Poison Elves, and it retained that title until its final issue. This change was made as a direct response to some readers expressing their concern about the name of the comic. After all, this was the tail end of the Satanic Panic era, and any overt occult imagery or references to the devil were usually a cause for concern. So this title was a touch too edgy for the times and was, quite possibly, hurting the sales potential. Since the comic literally had nothing to do with the classic religious antagonist or any themes pertaining to that entity, Hayes made the rational decision to change the title to Poison Elves. Shortly thereafter, with the 11th issue, the series adopted a standard comic book format. These are two choices that gave the series a better chance at success. Hayes then continued to self-publish until the 20th issue. At that point, circa 1995, the comic book market went into freefall and self-publishing became a very risky venture. In order to continue the series, Hayes signed a 5-year deal with Sirius Entertainment, a new publisher that focused on creator-owned material. Their most significant titles being Cry for Dawn by Joseph Michael Lisner, who also co-founded the company, Akiko by Mark Crilly, and Scary Godmother by Jill Thompson. Following this change, Poison Elves was relaunched and then published by Sirius for another 80 issues. Poison Elves is one creator's vision, much like Cerebus and Elfquest. Notably, Hayes was open about the fact that both titles had a direct influence on Poison Elves, and more specifically on his original choice to self-publish. Stylistically, Elfquest doesn't appear to have influenced Poison Elves at all. Both feature elves, but that's roughly where the comparison ends. Although one could argue, Hayes attempted to do a grittier, full-figure version of the cute, classically short elves seen in Elfquest. Cerebus had a noticeable impact on the series. Both titles focus on misanthropic lead characters. The overall tone is both humorous and mildly nihilistic, and there's a very solid direction that eventually emerges. Both also contain ridiculous antagonists that seemingly appear out of nowhere. Cerebus had the cockroach and Elrod, while Poison Elves had the purple marauder. Notably, Hayes arranged panels and frame sequences in a manner that was very reminiscent of Dave Sim's style. In some respects, Hayes imitated it very well. The style of storytelling, the staging, and panel arrangements would remain somewhat static during the series. Essentially, Hayes never evolved these artistic tools beyond the basics. Regardless, they were functional, effective, and communicated the scenes rather well. The actual narrative itself would noticeably improve over the first few years. Hayes may have begun the series as an angsty young man, inspired to follow a unique, brutal path in the fantasy genre. But over time, he would develop a voice that was more mature and tempered. The world of Poison Elves filled out and became tangible. It mapped out its own reality, establishing a history and a mythology, and there were some anachronistic modern touches, all of which had the effect of making the story feel like it's happening in some timeless era. Certainly, it was grim and gritty, but it was also humorous, grounded, and an interesting take on the fantasy genre. The early self-published issues are a bit awkward, despite Hayes' best efforts. They definitely contain an amateur feel about them, like most independent comics do during their early days. However, what's also present is a perceptible enthusiasm. But the skill to tell a comic book story hadn't fully developed. By the time the series landed at Sirius, Hayes' capabilities had noticeably evolved, and the series flowed a lot better at that point. The first 20 self-published issues are somewhat random adventures, but there is a continuity. In fact, one of the strengths is the sense of an organic flow from one adventure to another. While some elements may be rough in places, the bulk of the world building and character creation takes place during this portion. The pace is reasonably even, the tone was consistent, and there is a noticeable evolution. Critically speaking, some issues got a bit wordy, and the artwork could be a bit confusing, especially during action sequences. Hayes could have used a reasonably decent editor to catch basic spelling and grammar errors, and to help trim some of the heavy text pieces. The lettering was also, well, consistently inconsistent. As an element of the page, it was never integrated very well. Overall, the changes could have given the title a more polished presentation and may have heightened its appeal. And yes, Hayes did have a tendency to draw lingerie-wearing women with, ample proportions, which was more than a little cheesecakey at times. Sometimes, these panels or splash pages appear to have had a lot more artistic effort than the panels or pages that preceded them. So they were, the money shot, so to speak. Instead of referring to this as a fixation, or pandering to the male gaze and the artist's own taste, let's call it a recurring motif. That being said, the majority of the female characters in the series weren't simply eye candy or damsels in distress. Most kicked as much ass and took as many names as the lead character. Although there were times when depictions of secondary characters were, a bit questionable. It's safe to suggest Poison Elves was a product of its time and a reflection of the creator's level of maturity. Hayes did have an obvious affection for Lucifer. For the record, Lucifer was a character Hayes had created and played in Dungeons & Dragons during his late teen years, so there was a natural affinity the creator had developed for the character. This is worth mentioning because, at first, Lucifer seems like a character created by a young man. He's brash, overconfident, and he gets into fights with very little provocation. He drinks to excess and broods about the difficulties in his life. In other words, he seems very surface level, like a young, undeveloped man coming to terms with being an adult. More to the point, at times, it seems like Lucifer is a character living out the creator's male power fantasies. And perhaps, Hayes was also working through his own issues or insecurities through Lucifer. However, Lucifer does evolve through the series. His backstory is filled in, and this adds some tragic depth to the character. In the end, he may not be all that likable, but his character flaws and motivations are given the proper context. As a side note, there was, allegedly, a mock feud that occurred between Drew Hayes and Brian Michael Bendis. This was supposed to have happened in their respective letters page. Unfortunately, no dates or any other relevant details are documented. So guess what I did? Exactly. I went through the letters page of all 100 issues of Poison Elves looking for a letter or letters from Bendis, and found nothing. However, the inside cover of each issue contained Hayes' own starting note. This was, basically, him rambling about his life and other related stuff, and it's here that Hayes mentions Bendis in a disparaging, clearly comical manner. Although, I could only discover 3 mentions, in issues 14, 19, and 25. So this mock feud did take place, and it happened in 1996, while Bendis was writing and drawing Jinx at Caliber. Unfortunately, I don't have access to those Caliber issues, so I can't confirm whether Hayes wrote to Bendis, or, for that matter, what Bendis wrote in response. But this fake feud apparently did occur, and presumably, it was just 2 creators mutually poking fun at one another. End of side note. For those interested, the entire 20-issue self-published run and the first 39 issues of the Sirius series are recommended. In essence, this amounts to one complete story. The self-published run sets up the characters and the setting, and the first 39 Sirius issues tell one massive story called Sanctuary. It's Sanctuary that is the most compelling portion of the Poison Elves saga. One could just read the Sanctuary story on its own, but it might not be as effective. At this point, the world is established, the characters are in place, and it may feel like one is coming into a story that's already in progress. The remainder of the series does contain story arcs that seemingly build to one overall epic, and they are worthwhile to read. Unfortunately, there is no resolution provided. Whatever direction was intended will remain untold. It's worth mentioning, there are a variety of spin-offs and mini-series based on Poison Elves lore, some of which were not done by Hayes himself, although presumably he had input on those side projects. Poison Elves abruptly stopped at the beginning of a story arc in 2004. Hayes did intend to return to the series, possibly with a quarterly schedule, but health issues prevented the creator from returning. Unfortunately, Hayes would pass away in March of 2007 at the age of 37. A final tribute issue would be published later that same year. This issue was composed of notes and sketches that detailed where the series would have gone had Hayes not passed away. In 2013, another writer and artist stepped in to continue along the path that Drew Hayes had previously mapped out. However, this venture lasted all of 3 issues before the series was indefinitely put on hold. It's not clear why this occurred. Quite likely, sales were far below expectations. Further adventures are unlikely to appear, and honestly, that's for the best. In the end, as stated earlier, Poison Elves is one creator's unique vision, and that's its appeal. There is an intrinsic quantum entanglement between the creator and the creation, and this is not something that can be easily replicated even by the most skilled creator. While we'd like to believe that most characters or stories can live beyond the death of their creator, Poison Elves is an example that disproves this notion. Certainly, the stories are there to be enjoyed, and they will always exist, but they will never continue on because there is no one to move them forward. All there is all there ever will be, and somehow that seems appropriate. Thanks to all my subscribers, and an even larger thanks to those that directly support this channel with their memberships. Like, comment, and share. All feedback helps me determine what to produce in the future as I try to build this channel into something sustainable. Thanks for watching. Until next time.